Hi, folks. I want to talk to you today about the ongoing coverage in the Western media, specifically the UK and the US, about the opening of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya and how the media here in the US and across the pond in the UK seem to have gone into full meltdown mode over what's happened recently in India. Keep in mind that the opening of the temple in Ayodhya is the first time in about 500 years that a non-Abrahamic religious structure has been reconstructed and put in front of its people again. The Western media doesn't seem to be too happy about this development. Look at all these headlines from all these Western publications: The Economist, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, Time Magazine, The Times of London. They don't seem to be very happy at the developments in Ayodhya. They're clearly building a consistent anti-Hindu and anti-Indian narrative with all the reporting. When you see these media reports, you may think that this problem is restricted to the media alone, but it's not. These reports are reflective of the general attitudes in these societies and some deeply held beliefs that are embedded in the political and intellectual consciousness of these societies. Understand, too, that this bias against India is not a new phenomenon. The West has been defaming India for at least 500 years. And this bias started based on notions of racial superiority, cultural superiority, and religious superiority. Let's take a quick look at the origins of this bias. Take a look at this map from the year 1821. This map is pretty much in sync with the British colonial view of India and the world at that time. It neatly divides the world into enlightened, civilized, half-civilized, and barbarous parts of the world. Keep in mind that the British had already had a presence in India for well over 100 years by this point. Both the UK and the US were well aware of India's achievements. This was a country and a civilization that had already produced marvels of architecture in the form of great temples. It had expertise in textiles. It had produced a system of indigenous medicine. It had expertise in metallurgy. It had discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, mining. It had produced one of the great philosophical schools of thought. The list of achievements is a really long one, but the West was still describing India as a half-civilized country. This is truly a travesty, and clearly the facts didn't matter then either. In 1835, Thomas Macaulay, a British official posted in India at the time, proposed a new education system for India. And he also said, as part of his proposals, that he felt that a single bookshelf of European literature was worth the entire literature of India and Arabia. The notion of religious superiority played a very significant role in colonizing Indian territory and in colonizing the Indian mind. Max Muller, who was a well-known Orientalist and expert on India, was intimately familiar with the great Hindu religious works of India. But in the year 1866, he wrote to a scholarly friend of his by the name of Baron von Bunsen that India was like a quote-unquote rotten tree, ripe for conversion to Christianity, and that he would gladly participate in the process of overthrowing the mischief of priestcraft and bringing in Christian teachings. So this was a man who was intimately familiar with all the knowledge that India had produced in literature and philosophy. In 1899, Rudyard Kipling, the British author, described Britain and America as civilizing nations with a white man's burden, whose duty it was to civilize the less developed societies and peoples of the world. So this white man's burden concept was well embedded in the British and American minds for quite a long time. And I dare say it hasn't gone away completely. The truth about India's problems was vastly exaggerated. It was necessary for the British to convey this impression of superiority over an inferior people, because that would help justify their colonial rule and the bias against people that they had based on this worldview that I described to you. Colonial rule in India faded eventually as Britain was a spent power by 1945. It ceded dominance in political and economic affairs to America, but Britain still remained a fairly potent force in terms of financial services and the media. Now, India was still a developing country with a fairly small economy, and its rate of economic growth was not that great. So, Western economies controlled the flow of information and money at the time. They used a term called the Hindu rate of growth. It's amazing that a term like that would be used for India, because a poor South American country that professed Christianity would not be described as having a Catholic rate of growth, or a Protestant rate of growth, or a Methodist rate of growth, or something like that. It was only India which is called an economy with a Hindu rate of growth. And unfortunately for India, people simply weren't aware of the bias against them at the time, because information was not so freely available then as it is now. The Indian elite, the English speaking elite, among whom Nehru was one of the chief figures, also constantly looked to England and America for approval on their actions, whether it was in the field of literature or science or economics. They constantly looked to the West for approval and sought their blessings on what they were doing. Coverage of events in India was largely dismissive, and it was based a lot on impressions that had been created in the West by rather biased portrayals of poverty and slow economic growth in India at the time. As the situation in India improved, with the economy, with better social equality, with things like the privy purses of the former Rajas being abolished, the Green Revolution taking hold, the West simply could not dismiss India anymore. So they decided that if they couldn't dismiss India, they certainly didn't want to write anything positive about India. So they simply ignored or cancelled India's achievements altogether. Here's a good example for you. This is how the intellectuals in the West still think a lot about India. This is a book on great wars that were fought throughout world history. It talks about wars that literally shaped countries. Now, India fought a war in 1971 against Pakistan, and the result of the war was the creation of the state of Bangladesh. If there was a war that shaped history, if there was a war that created a nation, that shaped a nation, this was it. But books like this simply ignore events from India because it doesn't fit the agenda or the bias against India. So as you can see, the 1971 war between India and Pakistan, resulting in the creation of Bangladesh, doesn't find a mention in this book at all. Now, this bias continued through the 70s and the 80s, but now the situation has changed. India is now a growing power. It has a huge economy. It is a military power. It is an intellectual power with great contributions to the world in many areas of science and medicine. So now the West simply cannot ignore India anymore. The problem now is that India doesn't fit the model or the box that the West has been trying to put it into for decades. It has its own civilization, it has its own achievements, it has its own economic system, which is a mixed economy, with elements of socialism and capitalism. It has a huge diversity of cultures, religions, languages, foreign policy course that's completely independent of the West. This is a real problem for countries in the West because they want clients. They don't want competitors. They want markets. They don't want competition in manufacturing. So if you want to put a country like India on the defensive, how do you go about doing that? You use information as a weapon, because information gives these countries the power to shape the flow of the news, the way the news is reported, the way people perceive the news. So they can shape countries as they see suiting their own needs. You'll be able to see the types of media bias that are at work here. Cherry picking the facts, distorting the facts, gross exaggeration, sensationalism, drawing a false equivalence between two sides in a dispute, demonstrating their bias in every way possible. The problem also is that these outlets will never allow an opposing voice to present historical facts which affect events in India, such as the partition of India, which resulted in a unique situation in India where it is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural society, but the parts of India that belong to it, the parts of India that separated from it, have largely become single religion societies. Even the terminology used in these articles and on social media posts is very mischievous. Look at this one, for example. By constantly using the term Hindu nationalist, they are trying to drive a wedge between communities and weaken social cohesion in India. See, in the Western mind, the term nationalist evokes images of authoritarianism, like the Nazis in Europe. If an academic like Ian Bremmer is using the term Hindu nationalist, he's not doing it being unaware of the consequences of using that term. He knows exactly what that means. Even the use of the term cow vigilante or lynching is very mischievous, because what it does is it creates a relation between people in India and the whites in America who were persecuting the blacks following the end of the Civil War in the 1860s in America. So there were vigilante bands and there was lynching of black people in America during that period. So to cater to an American audience, this terminology is used to equate even the smallest incidents in India with crimes that were committed decades ago in America. There's also a tendency among Western reporters and intellectuals to oversimplify things and bring them down to the level that people in the West can understand. Look at this picture from CNN, for example. This article from CNN has a photograph saying that this man who is a pilgrim visiting Ayodhya is quote unquote painting his face, as though he's some child at an American country carnival where face painting is offered. The fact that he's actually applying a sacred tilak symbol on his forehead for a religious ceremony is completely ignored. Take a look at this screenshot of an article in Time magazine by Audrey Truschke, who's a professor of South Asian Studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey in America. So in her article, she says, she uses the term alleged temple, even though it has been established beyond the shadow of a doubt via clearly documented archaeological evidence that a temple was destroyed. A Hindu temple was destroyed and a mosque was built over it. CNN and other outlets don't even mention that an ancient Hindu temple was destroyed by Mughal invaders in the 1500s. And they purposely omit facts from stories like this. For them, facts don't matter. Let me show you a screenshot of another article that's written by Ashutosh Varshney. Ashutosh Varshney is a faculty member who teaches subjects related to South Asia at an American university. So I'm sure this gentleman is familiar with the concept of universal adult franchise and that the Constitution of India guarantees equal rights to all citizens, regardless of their religious affiliation. So equality of all citizens under law is one of the founding principles of the Republic of India. Now, despite that, to an audience who's unfamiliar with Indian conditions and Indian law, the breathless statements that Ashutosh Varshney is making in this article would make it seem like minorities in India or non-Hindus are standing on the edge of a cliff, or they're on the brink of some sort of impending disaster. Now, Atish Tasir wrote an article in Time magazine where he calls Modi divider in chief. So this constant anti-Modi drumbeat also is a feature of Western reporting. They keep saying that he's anti-Muslim. Now that's interesting because a whole bunch of Islamic countries have given this leader award after award. He has been awarded the Order of Abdulaziz Al Saud by Saudi Arabia in 2016. He was given the State Order of Ghazi Amir Amanullah Khan by Afghanistan in 2016. He was given the Grand Collar of the State of Palestine by the Palestinians in 2018. He was given the Order of Zayed by the UAE in 2019. He was given the King Hamad Order of the Renaissance in Bahrain in 2019. But that doesn't seem to be enough for these journalists. They still have to constantly pound on his supposed anti-Muslim record. If Modi and the BJP were in fact so anti-Muslim, it would be extremely surprising to see that all these rulers from these Islamic states are giving Modi the highest honors, recognizing the work that he's doing to further relations between Islamic countries and India. These journalists also constantly try and portray Indian politics as some sort of zero-sum game, where if one community gains a benefit, the other community suffers a corresponding loss. This is obviously not the case in India. So the Indian economy and India in general are like a ship on a rising tide. And a rising tide raises all ships, not just one ship. So some of the motivations for these journalistic outlets today are simple business considerations. They want to keep making money by feeding people the stories that they want to continue reading. They want to keep things as simple as possible, kind of dumb them down so everybody's able to understand them easily, whether their stories are accurate or not. They're also pandering to some of the desires of the governments that they're serving, because it's advantageous to keep India on the defensive, and that helps these governments in the West. Now, the irony is that if these Western outlets really wanted to produce factual, well researched articles on India, they could do it quite easily. They have the money and they have the resources to do it if they like to do it. For example, coverage of Israel in the American media is funded, and there are dozens of reporters from America on the ground in Israel. Coverage on Israel is generally favorable because Israel happens to be an American ally. But even in the case of India, it would be possible to have many reporters stationed there if needed. The problem is that there is very little research that happens on these stories by actual writers based in America. The work is all done by writers and by journalists in India. And these are generally folks with a leftist bent of mind with their own agenda. So these Indian journalists covering events in India for Western outlets are quite happy to produce anti-India stories as needed. So whether it's Rana Ayub writing for the Washington Post, whether it is Barkhadat writing for Western outlets, whether it's Atish Tasir writing for a Western outlet, you'll find a common thread running through all their stories. I'm going to share with you some of the research produced by Professor Ramesh Rao, Columbus State University in the state of Georgia. He's a professor of communications, and he did some research on coverage from the New York Times on India. So I'm showing you some of these on screen right now. Here's a list of headlines and articles from the New York Times over a certain period. And you constantly see terms like Hindu, Hindu nationalists, Hindu cow vigilantes, Hindu group, Hindu revival, Hindu coalition, Hindu cleric. All of these terms are used negatively. There's almost never an editorial that has anything positive to say about India, and which is really unfortunate in my view. And why is the Western media now specifically so angry about Ayodhya? Ayodhya has all of these elements: a religion that the West doesn't really understand, a history that the West doesn't really understand. It's based on an epic story which the West doesn't really understand. There's archaeological evidence for a temple being destroyed in Ayodhya, which they don't want to see or understand. There's artistic excellence in temple building that they can't understand. And as I mentioned, this is the first time in the last 500 years that a major non-Abrahamic religious structure has been rebuilt. And as such, it is a symbol of the Hindu Renaissance and the reawakening. So the problem for the West too is that it may herald a similar reawakening in other cultures against the religions which destroyed indigenous religions and traditions to begin with. So this temple in Ayodhya is a perfect vehicle for anti-India propaganda. So how does this media bias matter to you as a citizen? The UK and the US obviously have a lot of influence in world affairs in this day and age. The governments there almost certainly have a role to play in this media bias against India. So this bias has serious implications in a variety of ways. If you constantly keep up the drumbeat saying that a place is violent, the tourists stop coming and business is affected. If you constantly keep up the drumbeat saying human rights in a country are in danger, then that country's weight at the UN is reduced. It becomes less of an authority at the UN in terms of human rights discussions and policy discussions. If you say that a government in a country is favoring certain businessmen at the expense of others, that discourages investment in the country. If you say that a certain religious community is being discriminated against, that it gives other countries leverage to interfere in your internal affairs, causing potential problems for you in a variety of areas. So as you can see, this is something that actually affects you directly as a citizen in many ways. If not in the short term, it affects the well-being of the country in the long term, and it affects your quality of life. So clearly there's a need to respond to this media bias, right? This is not the 1960s where people are completely uninformed and they have no idea what's going on with the media. So how do you go about doing that? So let me suggest a few ways. Get on social media and complain to the journalists who are writing biased articles. Don't let them get away with it. Complain to the organizations that these journalists are writing for. Go as high up the chain as you can in the organization. If you're a civic organization, consider asking for a meeting with the organization that's putting out all this biased news to see if they can discuss it with you and you can fix their coverage. Consider canceling your subscription to the news outlets that are producing these biased pieces of news. Write letters of complaint to the companies that are advertising on these media outlets which are producing all these biased pieces of news. Get in touch with YouTubers and bloggers who can actually highlight instances of media bias like I'm doing for you right now. I believe in the long term, India will also have to have a trained core of lawyers and journalists who are fair and unbiased and looking out for India's interests and can speak out and act against these biased Western outlets so that they can stop doing what they're doing. They have been behaving so far like the facts don't matter. Ultimately, we'll have to bring them to the point where facts do matter. If you like the material I presented today, please consider giving the video a like. Please share it with other people who may be interested in this subject, and also consider subscribing to this channel for more content like this. Until next time, take care.